I was permitted to start partial weight bearing 7 weeks after my midfoot fusion. The surgeon recommended that I try walking around the house without the crutches if I wanted to, but that if it was too painful or uncomfortable to continue using the crutches. He did not want me leaving the house without the crutches for the time being. As you can probably tell from the video, my first attempts at partial weight bearing were very wobbly. It was pretty uncomfortable. I was having a hard time, but I was also very excited to start with the partial weight bearing, to start working towards being more mobile and active. I was continuing to have a lot of pain at this point after my surgery. Numbness, burning, stabbing, stinging, and shooting pains were the most common. The surgeon said that these were all typical types of pain at this point of recovery after my surgery, but that he wanted to keep an eye on whether the pain was continuing at that level of severity in the coming months. But that in the meantime I needed to be cautious with the amount of weight I was putting on my foot and to be cautious with how much activity I was doing at once. It was difficult at the beginning of partial weight bearing because my foot did not feel like it was reacting very well to having weight put on it, and it would swell very easily, so I had to do a lot of elevation and icing and take a lot of breaks from activity. I would also sometimes get pain up to my knee during weeks 8 and 9 after my surgery, the second and third weeks of partial weight bearing. It was also more difficult than I thought it would be recentering my center of balance when switching from non-weight bearing to partial weight bearing, and that took a lot of conscious effort while I was making that switch. Thankfully, my surgeon sent a referral to physical therapy once I could start partial weight bearing, and that helped immensely with a lot of the issues that I was having as I was beginning to walk. It wasn't until week 11 after my surgery, about week 4 of being weight bearing, that I took about 30 steps at home without crutches for the first time. And my foot and ankle were pretty painful after that. During the coming weeks, I kept working on being able to walk short periods of time in my walking boot without the crutches at home, but it wasn't easy because my foot would swell up and become pretty painful. With the help of physical therapy, walking slowly became easier with each week, but it did continue to be painful, especially when walking on concrete. I was also working on taking short walks outside with my crutches since it was fall and I wanted to enjoy the nice weather and the changing leaves. Having a crutch helped lessen the impact of my foot against the concrete, and I was able to feel a surprising amount of impact and surface changes through the walking boot when I walked outside. Although this made walking on sidewalks and driveways more difficult since harder surfaces were painful, this was mainly a good thing because I could tell when surfaces were bumpy, and I needed to adjust my steps for those kinds of changes in what I was walking on. During week 13 after my surgery, walking outside was slowly becoming easier with practice for short periods of time, although concrete did still feel too hard against my foot without the help of a crutch. I was able to walk outside for about 10 minutes at a time, and managing the small hill by my house was also becoming easier, but I would get a good amount of pain and swelling, so I would need to ice and elevate my foot right after walking each time. Inside the house, I was able to move around without the crutches just fine. My family was saying that it was strange to see me be able to just get up and move around without a knee scooter or crutches, and my husband Matt was saying that I was starting to look less hobbled when walking around, and my gait was becoming much smoother. I still had to limit how much time I spent standing and walking around, but moving around indoors was becoming easier, and I was enjoying being able to do more around the house. I was able to do simple cleaning tasks and basic cooking. I couldn't stand over the stove for long periods of time, but preparing things to cook in the oven was pretty easy for me since I would get sitting breaks and would be able to get up and go check on what was in the oven. On October 31st, which was 14 weeks or 3 months after my surgery, I had a follow-up with my surgeon, and the x-ray showed enough bone fusion for me to begin transitioning out of the walking boot. I was feeling cautiously optimistic about the process. I was, of course, ecstatic about the news that things were going well, but also a little nervous because the process of relearning to walk with physical therapy so far had been a little slow and pretty painful. The surgeon let me know that I could begin to slowly transition out of the walking boot at home as tolerated, and that I should continue to use the walking boot out of the house and to work with my physical therapist to fully transition out of the walking boot. It ended up being a more difficult process than I had thought it would be to transition out of the walking boot. It took me 3 or 4 days just to remember how I used to walk before my surgery, which was heel to toe, and to figure out how to walk naturally again. It started out as being very painful. My ankle and foot felt really stiff, and this lasted for weeks. Despite this, I still felt an overwhelming sense of relief to be taking this major step towards walking out of the walking boot, and for the first time since I'd first been injured over 6 years ago, I was finally starting to feel some hope about being permanently recovered soon. I did have a bit of a limp when I first started practicing walking without the walking boot, not because the initial pain was that bad, but because my foot had been injured and I'd needed to be careful for so long that it did feel sensitive and very strange to have it outside of the boot. I had to focus on walking so that I didn't have a limp, and using the crutches to help me transition out of the walking boot helped a lot. I really wanted to avoid getting into the habit of having a limp, and so having the crutches, at least just one crutch, did help a lot with that. It felt weird having both sides of my body be at the same height again after having the walking boot make the right side of my body a little taller for so long, and I found myself having to shift my center of gravity a little bit again to accommodate for that change when I was transitioning out of the walking boot. I was able to start walking outdoors on concrete with my walking boot without needing the crutches anymore. It was becoming much easier to walk outdoors without the crutches for short periods of time. I did still need to use the walking boot indoors at times because my foot would become painful from walking without the boot pretty quickly during the first several days of transitioning out of the walking boot. I needed to stretch my foot and ankle after walking each time because walking without the boot would make my toes, foot, and ankle pretty stiff. During the first several days after I got the news from the doctor that I could transition out of the walking boot, I was still wearing the boot more often than not in the house, but it was still a relief knowing that I didn't have to put my walking boot back on every single time I was getting up to do something. Also, practicing walking without the boot on for 5 to 10 minutes at a time was helping strengthen my foot and ankle without feeling like I was stressing it out too much. My foot was slowly getting used to being able to walk a little more and do more exercise at the gym, but I would still get a good bit of swelling and pain as soon as I would hit my limit for movement. I was taking a lot of breaks throughout the day to elevate and ice my foot and would need to stretch my foot and ankle quite often because it had gotten stiff from not being used to walking without the walking boot on for so long. My foot was slowly getting used to being able to walk a little more and do more exercise at the gym, but I would still get a good bit of swelling and pain as soon as I would hit my limit for movement. I was taking a lot of breaks throughout the day to elevate and ice my foot and would need to stretch my foot and ankle quite often because it had gotten stiff from not being used to walking without the walking boot on for so long. When I had my first physical therapy session with the walking boot off, it was pretty exciting, but my foot got very painful about halfway through the session since it was not used to being in a sneaker instead of the walking boot. My physical therapist suggested continuing using my walking boot outdoors when I was walking until I was able to walk indoors without my walking boot 100% of the time. When I first started leaving the house with both my shoes on and no walking boot, I had to wear gauze pads over my scar on top of my foot for weeks to protect the scar and loosen my right shoe. The way the shoe pressed against my scar would make my foot incredibly painful, but the arch support that my shoes gave me was incredible relief, and so it was a very conflicting feeling having shoes on for quite some time. I was also having trouble getting my calf muscles, ankle, and foot to work well together to walk smoothly outside. I felt slow and uncoordinated, and it was very painful, but it felt like a massive win to finally start walking outdoors in shoes with no crutches. It felt to me like I was limping about 3.5 months after my surgery, but my family said that it didn't look like it. It didn't feel like my midfoot was bending as much in my right foot as it did in the left while walking, which I supposed was normal since I had gotten a fusion, but it sure did feel annoying. As I continued to work on walking without my walking boot, I was getting used to having more natural ankle, foot, and toe movements while walking. Since the boot very much controls these movements while you're in it, everything was very stiff, and it was taking a while to get used to all of these natural movements once again while walking. I was working on getting hourly steps 12 hours a day so that I could get used to walking small amounts at a time at regularly spaced intervals throughout the day. My foot was continuing to be pretty painful when I was walking, and it would swell quite a bit, so I was doing a little bit at a time since the surgeon didn't want me to be pushing through pain and slowing down the recovery from having too much extra swelling. Doing the hourly steps did help me be able to start getting around the house more easily because it was a gentle way of challenging my foot in addition to the short walks that I was doing outside, sometimes even with my husband. At 3.5 months, I was able to do some 10-minute walks outside, but always had to elevate and ice my foot immediately afterwards because of pain and swelling. My physical therapist recommended using light compression socks to help with the swelling because at this point the swelling seemed to be what was contributing to a lot of my pain and discomfort. The compression did help my foot recover from walking much better, especially when combined with icing afterwards, and I soon started to be able to walk for slightly longer periods of time. During week 17 after my surgery, I was working on increasing my walking a bit and taking some 15-minute walks in my neighborhood. I still wasn't a very fast walker, and I was getting a lot of pressure from walking with the hardware, so these walks were typically around half a mile to 0.6 miles in 15 minutes. As I continued to work on walking a bit more, I did need to be mindful of how much I did at once. I continued to use the compression socks, but would need to sit down often to take breaks from being up, and would need to ice my foot at least twice a day to help keep the swelling down. Using the compression socks helped immensely with keeping the swelling down, and that helped my foot recover much better and faster from activity, so I was able to start walking more easily and also start increasing the length of times that I was able to be walking for. Throughout the rest of November, I continued to work on slowly increasing the length of time that I was able to walk. My main issue for the rest of that month was standing in place for more than a minute at a time because my foot would become painful very quickly and would swell up, and having to increase my activity slowly. I was also getting quite a bit of pressure from the screws in place in my foot, which did also cause some stiffness, but the stiffness continued to get better the more I walked. I did have days that I had to take much easier than others that month due to extra pain or soreness, but overall I couldn't believe the amount of progress that I had made in November. I was able to average 2.1 miles a day that month, with the least amount of walking in a day in November being 1.2 miles and the most in a day being 3.2 miles. As you can tell, the first couple of months of relearning to walk were quite the process, and there is still some work to do to get back to the levels of activity that I was used to before the surgery and before my injury, but I am feeling pretty good about working my way back to what I used to be able to do. This video ends on November 30th, 2024, which is exactly 4 months after my surgery, and I will be sure to keep you all updated on how things continue to go.